The moment my sister called me broke in front of my entire family, I remember thinking something felt off, and not just because of the way everyone suddenly went quiet. It happened in my father's living room on a gray Saturday afternoon in late October, the kind of cold Midwest day where the sky looks like it's made of wet concrete and the wind rattles the last dry leaves across the driveway. My dad, Robert Harper, had passed away 3 weeks earlier, and that afternoon was the first time most of the extended family had gathered together since the funeral. The official reason was simple enough: our father's attorney was coming to read the will. But if you've ever been part of a family meeting like that, you already know it's never just about paperwork. There's always something else in the air: old grudges, quiet judgments, the kind of tension that doesn't show up until everyone's sitting in the same room pretending they're fine. I remember standing near the kitchen doorway holding a paper cup of lukewarm coffee when my sister Rachel laughed loudly from the couch. It wasn't the kind of laugh people make when something's actually funny. It was sharper than that. The kind meant to make sure everyone heard it. "Well," she said, leaning back with her arms folded like she owned the place, "I guess some people suddenly remember they have a family when there's money involved." A few heads turned right away. Some of my cousins looked at her. Others looked at me. And the strange thing is, at first I honestly thought she wasn't talking about me. I mean, sure, Rachel and I had our disagreements over the years, but hearing something like that in a room full of relatives, that was different. Then she looked straight at me. Not angry. Not even really emotional. Just confident. Like she'd already decided how this whole afternoon was going to play out. And suddenly that quiet feeling in the room shifted. You know the kind of silence I'm talking about. The kind where nobody wants to say anything because they're waiting to see what happens next. Looking back now, I realize that moment was the first sign something bigger was going on. At the time, though, I just stood there holding my coffee like an idiot, trying to figure out whether she was joking or not. "Rachel, my Aunt Linda said cautiously from one of the armchairs, this probably isn't the time." But Rachel didn't even glance at her. She kept her eyes on me, her expression calm in a way that honestly made the whole thing feel more deliberate. "I'm just saying," she continued, shrugging slightly, "funny how people show up when they think there's something waiting for them. Now, if you don't know my sister, you might think that sounds like a simple jab between siblings. But our family history isn't that simple. Rachel and I grew up in the same house outside Columbus, Ohio, but somewhere along the way our lives went in completely different directions. She stayed close to our dad. Worked nearby. Saw him almost every week. I moved 2 states away after a fight with him about 10 years ago. Not some dramatic screaming match or anything like that, just one of those long, quiet disagreements that never really gets resolved. After that, visits became less frequent. Calls even less. And in families like ours, distance has a funny way of turning into stories. Stories about why someone left. Stories about who cares more. Stories that slowly turn into the version of you people believe. I didn't realize how strong those stories had become until that afternoon. Because as Rachel sat there smiling slightly, I noticed something else happening around the room. My cousin Mark avoided eye contact. My Uncle Dave rubbed the back of his neck like he didn't want to get involved. A few relatives exchanged looks that told me something I hadn't fully understood before. Rachel hadn't just come up with that comment on the spot. She'd been building that narrative for a while. And apparently, a lot of people had already heard it. That I struggled financially. That I'd disappeared when Dad needed help. That I only showed up now because there might be an inheritance involved. None of it was completely true. But in families, truth doesn't always matter as much as repetition. Rachel leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "I mean, Daniel," she said casually, "you've always had a tough time with money, right?" A couple of people chuckled awkwardly. Not because they thought it was funny, but because nobody wanted to challenge her either. And that was the moment I realized something important. Rachel wasn't just insulting me. She was preparing the room. preparing everyone for a version of the story she clearly believed was about to be confirmed. At the time I didn't fully understand why. I didn't know what she thought the will was going to say. But she acted like the outcome had already been decided. Like the lawyer was just coming to make it official. Looking back now, that confidence is the part that stands out the most. Because Rachel wasn't nervous that afternoon. She wasn't uncertain. She looked completely relaxed, like someone who had already won an argument before it even started. And that's the thing that kept bothering me as I stood there listening to her talk about my finances, my life choices, my absence over the years. She sounded like someone who knew exactly how the next hour was going to end. What I didn't realize at the time was that the one person who could actually prove whether she was right, hadn't walked through the door yet. For a few seconds after Rachel said that, nobody moved. The room stayed wrapped in that awkward silence that happens when everyone senses something uncomfortable but nobody wants to be the first person to address it. I remember taking a slow sip of my coffee mostly just to give my hands something to do. It had gone cold by then, but I did not really notice. What I noticed instead was the way Rachel leaned back into the couch like she had just made a perfectly reasonable comment. She looked relaxed. Confident. Almost satisfied with herself. And the strange part is that the rest of the room seemed to accept that tone. No one directly challenged her. My cousin Mark gave a small shrug like it was not his business. My Uncle Dave cleared his throat and started studying the pattern on the carpet. Even Aunt Linda, who had tried to shut the comment down a moment earlier, just sighed quietly and folded her hands in her lap. Looking back now, that moment told me something important about the past few years. Rachel had been talking about me for a long time. Not necessarily in cruel ways all the time, but in small comments here and there. Stories about how I moved away. Stories about how I did not visit Dad as often as she did. Stories about how my career had taken a few turns that she probably described as unstable. And if you hear the same story often enough, people start to accept it as the truth. That was the narrative Rachel had built. I was the distant son. The unreliable one. The guy who could never quite get his life together. Meanwhile Rachel had stayed close to home. She worked about 15 minutes away at a dental office in town. She stopped by Dad's house regularly, helped him with groceries, drove him to appointments once in a while. From the outside it looked simple. Responsible daughter stays. Irresponsible son leaves. It made for a clean story. What people did not see were the details in between. They did not see the years when Dad and I argued about everything from career choices to where I should live. They did not see the quiet phone calls we still had late at night every few months where he would ask how work was going or whether I had finally learned how to grill a decent steak. Our relationship was complicated, but it was not absent the way Rachel sometimes described it. Still, standing there in that living room, I realized something uncomfortable. Rachel had been the one physically present. She had been the one people saw helping Dad. And in family dynamics, the visible version often becomes the accepted one. Rachel stretched her legs out and glanced toward the hallway where Dad's office used to be. Anyway, she said with another small laugh, I guess we will all find out soon enough. Her tone carried that same quiet confidence. Like the whole situation was already settled in her mind. Mark finally spoke up from the dining table. The lawyer should be here soon, right? Rachel nodded casually. Mr. Collins said around 2 o'clock. I glanced at the wall clock above the fireplace. It was about 1:45. 15 minutes to go. That might not sound like a long time, but when you are sitting in a room full of relatives waiting to hear how your father's life gets divided into legal language, every minute stretches out a little longer than usual. Someone turned on the small lamp beside the couch as the afternoon light faded behind the clouds outside. The room took on that dim golden glow that old houses seem to have in the fall. For a moment nobody said anything. Then Rachel spoke. Again, this time in a more conversational tone that somehow felt even more deliberate. I handled most of Dad's stuff these past couple of years anyway, she said. Bills, repairs, doctor visits. All the practical things. She looked around the room as she said it, making sure everyone heard. A few people nodded sympathetically. That must have been a lot of responsibility, Aunt Linda said. Rachel gave a small shrug, the kind people use when they want recognition but pretend they do not need it. Someone had to do it. Then she glanced toward me again. Not everyone lives close enough to help. That line landed softer than the earlier comment, but it carried the same message underneath. The narrative continued to build. Rachel was the responsible one. I was the distant one. I noticed a couple of my cousins glance at me again, not in a hostile way exactly, but with that quiet curiosity people have when they are trying to decide which version of a story they believe. And that was when a thought crossed my mind that I did not fully understand at the time. Rachel was not just making comments to hurt me. She was reinforcing something. Like she needed everyone in that room to remember her version of the past before the lawyer arrived. At the time I could not figure out why that mattered so much to her. But looking back now, the pattern feels obvious. Rachel believed she knew exactly what that will was going to say. She believed the reading would confirm everything she had been telling people for years. That she was the one who stayed. That she was the one who sacrificed. That she was the one Dad trusted most. And if that was true, then humiliating me in front of everyone first made perfect sense. Because when the lawyer finally opened that document, Rachel expected the result to prove that her story about me had always been right. The longer everyone sat in that living room waiting for the lawyer to arrive, the more Rachel seemed to settle into the role she had clearly decided to play that afternoon. It was subtle at first. She shifted comfortably on the couch like she was hosting a meeting instead of attending one. She straightened a stack of papers on the coffee table that I recognized as some of Dad's old bills. And maintenance receipts. She even got up at one point and adjusted the thermostat on the wall like she was already in charge of the house. None of those things were dramatic on their own, but taken together they created a very clear impression for everyone watching. Rachel was the one who had been running things. Rachel was the one who had been responsible. And slowly, conversation in the room started drifting in that direction. Uncle Dave leaned forward in his chair and asked Rachel about the roof repair Dad had done last year. Rachel explained how she had scheduled a contractor and compared estimates before choosing the company. Aunt Linda asked about Dad's medications during his final months. Rachel described how she organized the pill containers and kept track of doctor visits. Each answer was calm and detailed. She spoke like someone presenting evidence in a quiet argument that had been building for years. And every time she finished explaining something, she would glance briefly in my direction, not with anger exactly, but with that same confident look she had earlier. Like she expected everyone in the room to draw the same conclusion she already had. Eventually Mark spoke again from the dining table. That must have been exhausting, he said. Taking care of everything like that. Rachel gave another small shrug, but this time her voice carried a slightly heavier tone. It was not always easy, she said. But when someone has to step up, you do what you have to do. The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Nobody needed to ask what she meant. I noticed Aunt Linda glance toward me again, then quickly look back down at her hands. What struck me most was not the criticism itself. Families have disagreements all the time. What stood out was the timing. Rachel seemed determined to make sure the entire room heard these reminders before the lawyer arrived. Almost like she was laying out a closing argument before the final verdict. I leaned against the kitchen counter and tried to stay quiet. That has always been my instinct during family conflicts. I tend to watch first and speak later. Sometimes that approach works. Sometimes it just gives other people more room to talk. Rachel took another slow look around the room and then continued. Dad worried about things near the end, she said, lowering her voice slightly. Mostly about whether the house and everything would stay taken care of. That caught everyone's attention immediately. A house like Dad's carried weight in our family. It was not a mansion or anything like that, but it had been in our family for more than 30 years. The white two-story place at the end of Oak Ridge Drive with the wide front porch and the big maple tree in the yard. Everyone in that room had celebrated birthdays or holidays there at some point. Rachel rested her hands on her knees and continued carefully. He told me a few times that stability mattered to him, she said. That the property should stay with someone who actually understood what it takes to maintain it. Now that line was a little less subtle. A couple of people shifted in their seats. Uncle Dave raised his eyebrows slightly but did not interrupt. Mark rubbed his chin like he was thinking through the implication. Rachel was no longer just describing the past. She was guiding everyone's expectations about the future. I could almost see the logic forming in people's heads. Rachel stayed. Rachel helped. Rachel handled responsibilities. Therefore Rachel would probably inherit the house. It was a clean equation. One that Rachel seemed very comfortable reinforcing. She turned her head slightly and looked directly at me again. Running a property like this takes work, she added calmly. It is not really something you can manage from 2 states away. A few relatives nodded quietly. Not in agreement exactly, but in recognition of the practical point she had just made. I kept my expression neutral and took another sip of my coffee even though it had gone completely cold by then. Looking back now, I realized something else about that moment. Rachel was not just confident. She was certain. The way she spoke about the house, about Dad's concerns, about responsibility, it all carried the tone of someone who already believed the outcome had been decided. She acted like the will was simply going to confirm what she had been telling everyone all along. And the strange part is that her certainty began affecting the room. Conversations shifted. People leaned slightly toward her when they spoke. Even the physical space seemed to reorganize itself around her presence. She had taken control of the narrative without raising her voice or starting an argument. She just kept reinforcing the same idea from different angles until it sounded reasonable to everyone listening. That was when I started to feel something else beneath the surface of the conversation. Not anger exactly. More like a quiet curiosity. Because Rachel was not behaving like someone who was worried about what the lawyer might say. She was behaving like someone who already knew. By the time the wall clock reached 2 o'clock, the entire mood of the room had shifted in a way that felt difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. Conversations had slowed down. People stopped moving around as much. Even the small sounds in the house seemed louder than usual, like the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the soft ticking of the clock above the fireplace. Everyone knew why they were there, and now that the expected time had arrived, the anticipation began filling the silence between sentences. Rachel seemed completely comfortable inside that silence. She had moved from the couch to the armchair beside the coffee table, positioning herself almost at the center of the room. From where I stood near the kitchen entrance, I could see nearly everyone at once. Aunt Linda sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Uncle Dave leaned back with his arms crossed, studying the floor. My cousin Mark had his elbows on the dining table, scrolling through his phone for a moment before putting it away again. And Rachel sat forward slightly, her posture relaxed but deliberate, like someone who had been waiting all afternoon for a particular moment to arrive. She looked around the room once more and then gave a small sigh that sounded almost theatrical. "Well," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, "I guess we will see how everything worked out." No one responded right away. The statement was simple, but the tone behind it carried the same quiet certainty she had been projecting all afternoon. Then she glanced toward me again. "Although," she added casually, "some people might end up disappointed." A few relatives shifted in their seats. The comment was not loud or aggressive, but it landed in a way that made the room even more uncomfortable. I kept my expression neutral and set my empty coffee cup down on the kitchen counter behind me. Rachel watched that small movement and gave a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Daniel," she continued, speaking in a tone that sounded almost friendly on the surface, "I hope you are not expecting too much today. That was the first time she addressed me directly since the earlier comment about money. The room grew quiet again. Mark looked back and forth between us. Aunt Linda inhaled slowly like she was considering whether to intervene. I did not respond immediately. I had learned a long time ago that reacting quickly during family arguments rarely improved anything. Instead, I simply met Rachel's gaze and waited. She tilted her head slightly as if studying my face for a reaction. "I mean," she said with a light laugh, "you have always had a little trouble keeping things stable financially, right?" A couple of people glanced down at the floor. Someone shifted a chair slightly, creating a scraping sound against the hardwood. Rachel continued before anyone else could say anything. "There is nothing wrong with that," she added, raising her hands briefly like she was being generous. "Not everyone is good with money." The words were framed like reassurance, but the message underneath them was obvious. She was not just questioning my finances anymore. She was presenting it as established fact in front of everyone there. I noticed Mark's eyebrows lift slightly as he glanced toward me again. Uncle Dave rubbed his jaw slowly but stayed silent. Rachel leaned back in the chair and crossed one leg over the other, looking completely at ease with the attention she had drawn. "Dad used to worry about that sometimes," she said thoughtfully. "About whether certain people would be able to handle bigger responsibilities." The way she said certain people made the meaning clear without needing to say my name again. That was when the social pressure in the room really started to build. No one openly supported her, but no one challenged her either. In a room full of family members, silence can be just as powerful as agreement. And Rachel seemed to understand that. She turned slightly so more of the room could see her. "I mean honestly," she continued, "running a property like this takes discipline. Property taxes, repairs, insurance. It is not exactly cheap." She gestured lightly toward the window that faced the front yard, where the maple tree Dad had planted years ago stood against the gray afternoon sky. Someone who struggles with money would probably find that overwhelming. The comment hung there in the air, heavier than the earlier ones. This time there was no mistaking who she meant. I could feel several pairs of eyes shift toward me again. That was the moment I realized something important about Rachel's strategy. She was not simply insulting me. She was creating a public narrative right before the lawyer arrived. A narrative where I looked irresponsible, unstable, and incapable of managing anything valuable. And the more she repeated it, the more normal it began to sound. Rachel folded her hands neatly in her lap and gave a small smile to the room. "But I guess none of that really matters," she said calmly. "Because the will is going to make everything clear anyway." The confidence in her voice was unmistakable. She truly believed the next few minutes would prove her right in front of everyone there. And that belief made her bold enough to humiliate me openly. She turned toward me one last time, her expression composed and almost sympathetic. "You should probably prepare yourself," she said gently. "This might not go the way you think." For a second no one moved or spoke. The house felt strangely quiet again, as if everyone was holding their breath. Then, from somewhere near the front hallway, we heard the sharp sound of the doorbell ringing. The sound of the doorbell cut through the tension in the room like someone snapping a thread that had been stretched too tight. For a moment nobody moved. Everyone just looked toward the hallway where the front door stood, as if the entire afternoon had been building toward that exact sound. Rachel was the first to react. She stood up slowly from the armchair and smoothed the front of her sweater, her posture calm and composed like someone welcoming a guest into her home. "That must be Mr. Collins," she said, her voice steady and confident. She walked toward the hallway without looking back, and the rest of us listened to the quiet rhythm of her footsteps across the hardwood floor. I stayed where I was near the kitchen entrance, watching the room instead of the door. People shifted slightly in their seats. Uncle Dave leaned forward. Mark straightened his back at the dining table. Even Aunt Linda seemed to sit a little taller. As though everyone instinctively understood that whatever happened next would change the atmosphere of the room. A few seconds later the front door opened and I heard Rachel greeting someone in the entryway. Her voice carried that same controlled politeness she had been using all afternoon. "Mr. Collins, thank you for coming," she said warmly. Another voice responded, lower and more measured. I recognized it immediately even though I had not heard it in years. Mr. Collins had been my father's attorney for as long as I could remember. He was the one who handled the paperwork when Dad bought this house back in the 1990s, the one who helped set up Dad's small contracting business, the one who occasionally stopped by for coffee and quiet conversations at the kitchen table when Rachel and I were kids. Hearing his voice again after so long stirred something unexpected in me, like a memory surfacing from the back of my mind. A moment later Rachel stepped back into the living room followed by Mr. Collins. He looked older than I remembered, his hair now almost completely gray, but his posture was still straight and deliberate. He carried a thin leather briefcase under one arm and paused near the doorway, scanning the room with the calm attention of someone used to entering emotionally complicated situations. "Good afternoon," he said politely. Several relatives murmured greetings in return. Rachel gestured toward the center of the room. "Everyone is already here," she said, her tone confident again. "We were just waiting for you." Mr. Collins nodded slowly and stepped further inside. As he walked past me near the kitchen entrance, something subtle happened that almost nobody else seemed to notice. For a brief moment his eyes met mine. It was not a long look, just a quick glance that lasted less than a second, but there was a flicker of recognition there. Not surprise exactly. More like acknowledgement. Then he continued walking toward the coffee table where Rachel had already cleared a space for him. At the time I did not think much about that glance. But looking back now, it was probably the first real clue that the afternoon was not going to unfold the way Rachel expected. Mr. Collins set his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it carefully. The room grew quiet again as he pulled out a folder and adjusted his glasses. Rachel remained standing beside him, her hands loosely folded in front of her, almost like a host preparing to introduce the main event of the afternoon. "Thank you all for being here," Mr. Collins began calmly. "I know gatherings like this are not always easy." His voice was steady and professional, the kind of tone that carried authority without sounding dramatic. As he spoke, I noticed Rachel glance around the room again, clearly satisfied with the attention she had gathered. Everyone was watching now. The narrative she had built all afternoon had reached its final stage. The lawyer had arrived. The will was about to be read. And Rachel looked completely certain that the document inside that folder would confirm everything she had been saying. While Mr. Collins arranged his papers, my mind drifted briefly to something my father had said months earlier during one of our last private conversations. At the time it had seemed like a strange topic to bring up out of nowhere. We had been talking on the phone late one evening about ordinary things like work and the weather when Dad suddenly paused and asked me a question that caught me off guard. He asked whether I believed people could change the way others saw them after years of misunderstanding. I remember laughing slightly and telling him that family reputations were usually permanent. Dad did not laugh with me. Instead he said something I did not fully understand at the time. He said sometimes the truth just needs the right moment to show up. Standing there in the living room months later, watching Mr. Collins prepare the documents while Rachel stood confidently beside him, that old conversation surfaced in my memory again. And for the first time that afternoon, I began to wonder whether there might be more to the story than Rachel believed. The room settled into a deeper silence once Mr. Collins finished arranging the papers in front of him. The faint rustle of the document folder seemed unusually loud in the quiet living room. Outside the front window the gray October sky hung low over the maple tree in the yard, and the branches moved slightly in the wind. Nobody spoke. Everyone was waiting for the same thing. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses again and looked around the room before beginning. "Before I read the document," he said calmly, "I want to thank everyone for coming today." Robert Harper cared deeply about his family, and he believed it was important that his wishes be shared clearly. Rachel nodded slightly beside him as if she already agreed with every word. She remained standing near the coffee table, her posture relaxed but attentive, almost like a partner assisting with the process. This document, Mr. Collins continued, lifting the first page carefully, represents the final will and testament of Robert Harper. A few relatives shifted in their seats. Uncle Dave uncrossed his arms and leaned forward slightly. Mark rested his elbows on the dining table again. I stayed where I was near the kitchen entrance, watching the room more than the document itself. Rachel glanced briefly toward me before turning her attention back to the lawyer. The expression on her face carried the same quiet confidence she had shown all afternoon. Mr. Collins began reading the formal introduction, the standard legal language explaining the validity of the document and confirming that my father had signed it voluntarily. The words themselves were technical and predictable, but they carried a strange weight because everyone understood what they led toward. As the lawyer continued speaking, Rachel slowly lowered herself into the armchair again, crossing one leg over the other in a calm and controlled motion. She folded her hands in her lap and listened attentively. But after a minute or two she leaned slightly toward Aunt Linda and spoke in a quiet voice that was still loud enough for several people to hear. "Dad always believed in responsibility," she said softly. "He talked about that a lot during the last year." Aunt Linda nodded politely but did not respond. Rachel continued anyway. "He worried about whether certain things would be taken care of properly." That line carried the same implication she had been repeating all afternoon. She did not say my name, but the message was clear enough for anyone listening. I noticed Mark glance toward me again. Uncle Dave rubbed his chin slowly. Rachel's voice remained gentle and measured, almost sympathetic, which somehow made the comment feel even more deliberate. Mr. Collins paused briefly as he turned another page, and the quiet murmur of Rachel's conversation faded. The lawyer continued reading several smaller provisions in the will, including instructions about personal items and charitable donations my father had arranged. Each section passed without much reaction from the room. But Rachel seemed increasingly comfortable as the process moved forward. After another moment she spoke again, this time directing the comment more openly toward the group. "You know," she said with a small thoughtful smile, "managing a property like this house takes more work than people realize. Taxes alone are thousands of dollars every year." Uncle Dave nodded slowly. "That sounds about right." Rachel continued with the same calm tone. "And repairs can add up quickly too. Roof work, plumbing, insurance. It really requires someone who understands how to handle those kinds of responsibilities." The comment floated through the room like a quiet conclusion that nobody had formally announced. Rachel was guiding everyone toward the same assumption again. If responsibility determined inheritance, then the outcome was obvious. I noticed a faint flicker of discomfort pass across Aunt Linda's face, but she remained silent. Mark shifted in his chair. Rachel looked toward me once more, her expression almost sympathetic again. "Some people might find that overwhelming," she added gently. Then she turned back toward the lawyer as if the statement had simply been an observation about property ownership in general. What struck me in that moment was not just the criticism. It was the timing. Rachel was still shaping the expectations of the room even while the will was being read. She spoke like someone reinforcing a story that had already been accepted. And the more she repeated it, the more normal it sounded. Meanwhile Mr. Collins continued turning pages and reading through the legal language with steady precision. Every so often he would pause to ensure that everyone could follow the structure of the document. But I noticed something interesting about his tone. It remained calm and professional, yet there was a careful rhythm to the way he moved through the sections, almost as if he understood that the most important part of the document had not been reached yet. Rachel did not seem to notice that detail. She sat comfortably in the armchair, confident that the conclusion was approaching exactly the way she expected. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing the room for a particular outcome. And now she believed the final proof was only moments away. By the time Mr. Collins reached the middle section of the document, the room had grown so quiet that the sound of each page turning seemed to echo slightly off the walls. The earlier tension had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. Instead of whispered comments and subtle remarks from Rachel, there was now a focused silence that held everyone in place. The lawyer continued reading through the structured language of the will, moving carefully from one provision to the next. He mentioned several charitable donations my father had arranged for local community programs and a small scholarship fund connected to the trade school where he had once volunteered. Those details surprised a few relatives, but they did not trigger much reaction beyond quiet nods of approval. Rachel remained seated in the armchair beside the coffee table, still carrying the same composed expression she had maintained all afternoon. But I noticed something subtle beginning to shift in her posture. Earlier she had leaned back comfortably, confident and relaxed. Now she leaned slightly forward, her attention focused more closely on the document in Mr. Collins' hands. It was not anxiety exactly. It was more like anticipation. She clearly believed the most important section of the will was coming soon. Uncle Dave shifted his weight in his chair again and glanced briefly toward the front window before returning his attention to the lawyer. Mark folded his hands on the dining table and leaned closer, as though trying not to miss a single word. Even Aunt Linda seemed more alert now, her eyes moving carefully between Rachel and Mr. Collins as the reading continued. Mr. Collins paused again for a moment as he reached another section of the document and adjusted the position of the pages in front of him. When he spoke again, his tone carried the same calm authority it had held since the beginning. The following provisions concern the distribution of personal assets, he explained. Rachel nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on the document. That was when she made another quiet comment, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. Dad always believed people should receive what they had invested time and effort into, she said softly. Aunt Linda glanced toward her but did not respond. Rachel continued anyway, her voice calm and reflective. He believed actions mattered more than words. The implication once again floated through the room without needing to be stated directly. Rachel was reinforcing the same narrative she had been building since the afternoon began. Responsibility equals reward. Presence equals trust. And by that logic, she clearly expected the outcome to favor her. Mr. Collins continued reading through several smaller allocations involving personal belongings. My father had left certain tools to a longtime friend who had once worked with him in construction. He had also arranged for several family photographs and keepsakes to be shared among relatives. Those sections passed without tension, but the atmosphere in the room kept tightening slightly with each passing minute. Everyone understood that the most significant part of the will had not been reached yet. Rachel shifted in her seat again and rested her elbow lightly on the armrest of the chair. Her confidence remained visible, but I noticed the faintest trace of impatience beginning to appear in her expression. It was the look of someone waiting for a moment that had already been imagined many times. Meanwhile Mr. Collins turned another page and paused again before speaking. The room seemed to lean forward collectively. Even the quiet creak of the house settling in the cool afternoon air felt louder than before. Rachel glanced around the room briefly, almost as if measuring the attention she had gathered. When she looked back toward the lawyer, her expression returned to that calm certainty she had carried all day. She truly believed the next lines of the document would confirm everything she had been saying. From where I stood near the kitchen entrance, I watched the subtle tension building across everyone's faces. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved much at all. The air felt thick with expectation. And then Mr. Collins cleared his throat softly and rested one hand on the final page he had just uncovered. The remaining portion of this document concerns the primary assets of Robert Harper's estate, he said in the same steady tone. That sentence changed the entire room. Rachel straightened in her chair immediately, her attention fully locked on the document. Mark lifted his head slightly. Uncle Dave leaned forward again with his elbows on his knees. Aunt Linda inhaled slowly. The moment everyone had been waiting for was finally approaching. Rachel's eyes flicked briefly in my direction again, and the confidence in her expression returned in full. It was the look of someone who believed the next words would confirm everything she had predicted all afternoon. What she did not seem to realize was that the calm expression on Mr. Collins' face had not changed at all. And there was still one small detail about that final page that nobody in the room understood yet. Mr. Collins rested his hand on the final page for a moment before speaking again, and that pause alone seemed to pull every bit of attention in the room toward him. Nobody moved. The quiet was so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen behind me and the soft creak of the house settling against the wind outside. Rachel sat perfectly still in the armchair beside the coffee table, her back straight now, her chin slightly raised. The confidence she had carried all afternoon had returned in full force. From the look on her face, she believed the next few sentences would confirm everything she had been preparing the room to hear. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses once more and glanced down at the page. The remaining portion of this document concerns the primary assets of Robert Harper's estate, he repeated calmly. Rachel gave a small nod as if acknowledging that this was the moment she had been waiting for. Mark leaned forward further at the dining table. Uncle Dave rested his elbows on his knees. Aunt Linda clasped her hands together tightly in her lap. Mr. Collins continued in the same steady voice. Robert Harper owned several primary assets at the time this document was finalized, including the residential property located at 214 Oak Ridge Drive, the surrounding 2 acres of land attached to that property, and the remaining ownership of Harper Contracting Services. That line alone carried weight in the room. The house and the business were the centerpieces of everything my father had built over the past 30 years. Rachel's posture seemed to relax slightly as she listened, almost like someone hearing the introduction to a story whose ending she already knew. Mr. Collins continued reading. After careful consideration, Robert Harper determined the distribution of these primary assets in the following manner. Rachel glanced briefly around the room, and I caught a small flash of satisfaction in her expression. She believed the conclusion was seconds away. Mr. Collins lowered his voice slightly as he read the next line. The residential property located at 214 Oak Ridge Drive, including the surrounding land and all structural improvements on that property, is hereby transferred in full ownership to Daniel Harper. For a moment the room did not react at all. It was the kind of silence that happens when people hear something they did not expect and their minds need a second to catch up. Rachel blinked once, her expression frozen in place. Mark's head lifted suddenly from the dining table. Uncle Dave straightened in his chair. Aunt Linda looked from the lawyer to Rachel and then slowly toward me. Mr. Collins did not pause. He continued reading in the same calm tone. In addition, the operational ownership and remaining business assets of Harper Contracting Services are to be transferred to Daniel Harper, with the expectation that the company will continue operating under his direction should he choose to maintain the business. This time the silence cracked. Mark let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like disbelief. Uncle Dave leaned back in his chair, his eyebrows rising slowly. Rachel's posture had changed completely now. The relaxed confidence she had carried all afternoon disappeared in an instant. She sat very still for a second longer as if waiting for the lawyer to correct himself. When he did not, she spoke abruptly. That cannot be right. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room sharply. Mr. Collins looked up from the document calmly. The document is clear, he replied in the same measured tone. Rachel shook her head once, her composure beginning to crack. No, she said quickly. Dad would not have done that. Her eyes moved around the room, searching for support that had seemed guaranteed just minutes earlier. Nobody spoke. Mark looked down at the table. Uncle Dave rubbed the back of his neck slowly. Aunt Linda watched Rachel with an expression that mixed confusion and sympathy. Mr. Collins continued speaking gently but firmly. This will was finalized and signed 6 months ago in my office with 2 witnesses present. Robert Harper reviewed each section carefully before signing. Rachel's hands tightened around the armrests of the chair. He told me the house needed someone responsible, she said quickly. Someone who actually stayed here. Mr. Collins folded his hands on top of the document. Robert Harper discussed many things during our meeting, he replied. Including responsibility. The room had become completely still again, but now the silence carried a very different energy than before. Rachel looked toward me suddenly, and the confidence that had filled her earlier was gone. In its place was confusion, disbelief, and the uncomfortable realization that the story she had spent the entire afternoon telling had just collapsed in front of everyone who heard it. For several seconds after Rachel said that, nobody spoke. The room felt completely different from the way it had only a few minutes earlier. The confidence that had filled the space during Rachel's comments was gone, replaced by a quiet uncertainty that seemed to settle over everyone at once. Rachel remained frozen in the armchair beside the coffee table, her hands gripping the armrests as if she was trying to steady herself. She looked from Mr. Collins to the document in his hands and then slowly around the room, searching for something that no longer seemed to be there. The certainty she had carried all afternoon had disappeared. Mr. Collins remained calm, his posture unchanged. He allowed the silence to sit for a moment before speaking again. "There are additional provisions," he said in the same steady tone. Rachel blinked quickly and turned back toward him, as if she had just remembered the room was still listening. "Additional provisions," she repeated. Her voice was tighter now, the smooth control from earlier slipping slightly. Mr. Collins nodded once and continued reading. "Rachel Harper is to receive several personal assets listed in the following section, including family photographs, heirloom furniture pieces, and the remaining balance of Robert Harper's personal savings account." Rachel listened, but the words clearly were not what she expected to hear. She leaned forward suddenly. "Wait," she said. "What about the house? What about the business?" Mr. Collins gently tapped the document with one finger. "Those assets have already been assigned according to the instructions I just read." Rachel stared at him for a long moment as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something different. Around the room, the reactions were quiet but unmistakable. Mark slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyebrows still raised in surprise. Uncle Dave let out a long breath through his nose and rubbed his hands together as though processing what had just happened. Aunt Linda looked toward Rachel again, but this time her expression carried a soft kind of sympathy that had not been there before. Rachel looked around the room again, clearly trying to rebuild the narrative that had seemed so certain only minutes earlier. "Dad talked to me about responsibility," she said quickly. "He told me the house needed someone who would stay here." Mr. Collins folded the final page of the document neatly and rested his hands on top of the folder. "Robert Harper did speak about responsibility," he said calmly. "During our final meeting he explained that responsibility does not always look the same from the outside." That sentence landed quietly in the room. Rachel did not respond right away. She stared down at the floor for a moment before looking back up again, but this time her eyes did not carry the same authority they had earlier. The confidence had been replaced by something closer to confusion. Meanwhile the attention in the room had begun to shift. Earlier that afternoon everyone had been watching Rachel. Now several people were looking toward me instead. It was not admiration or celebration. It was more like curiosity, as if the story they had been hearing all day suddenly had a missing chapter. I stayed where I had been standing near the kitchen entrance, my hands resting lightly against the counter. The strange part is that I did not feel triumphant the way some people might imagine. Mostly I felt quiet. The entire afternoon had unfolded like a slow conversation that none of us fully understood until the last few minutes. Mr. Collins closed the folder and slid it back into his briefcase. "If anyone has questions about the document, I will be available to discuss them privately," he said politely. No one spoke right away. The house seemed to settle into a different kind of stillness now. Rachel remained seated for another moment before slowly standing up. She looked around the room once more, but the energy she had been drawing from earlier was gone. The story she had been telling about me had sounded convincing when the ending seemed predictable. Without that ending, the narrative no longer held the same power. Mark cleared his throat quietly and stood up from the dining table. Uncle Dave leaned back and glanced toward the window again. Aunt Linda gave Rachel a gentle look before lowering her eyes again. Looking back now, that afternoon stayed with me for a long time. Not because of the house or the business or the legal details inside that document. What stayed with me was how easily people accept the story that gets repeated the most often. 4 years Rachel had told a version of my life that sounded believable. I was the distant son. The unreliable one. The brother who struggled. And when she said those things in that living room earlier that day, most people did not question it. They simply assumed the final chapter would prove her right. But sometimes the truth does not argue with those stories. Sometimes it just waits quietly for the moment when the right person opens the right document and reads it out loud.